What if you ask her if you can do, like, we can do a live recording of the last episode? And have that be the presentation.
Okay, I might ask her that. That'd be really cool.
Yeah, like, if she's okay with it, like,
yeah. All right.
we can come in and just do that as the,
Sure.
you know.
You'd come in and say just to do that.
Yeah, I would do it. We just have
Alright.
to find, like, a day.
Yeah.
We don't want to take, yeah, well. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Feature Length Podcast Book Club. My name is Marco. I'm one of the usual hosts of the Feature Length Podcast, and as you know by now, I am joined by Dante.
Hey everyone.
Dante's back with his Tom Holland impression. Yeah, this is episode 3 of the book club. We are finishing up volume 1 of Frankenstein, aka the Modern Prometheus.
Mm-hmm.
I realized, by the way, if anybody who is doing this is following along from the 1831 text instead of the 1818, it's not actually split into volumes, it's just chapters all the way through.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but whatever. I mean,
it's not
figure it out.
Yeah, it's
online.
not a big
Find
deal.
a chart. I can't sit here and say, like, it. Anyway, so yeah, we're finishing volume 1, chapters 5 to 7 of the 1818 text, which, you know, it's split into 3 volumes. You can kind of think of that also as 3 acts, typically, is why it would be split up that way. So we're kind of at the end of Act 1 now a little bit, which we'll talk about at the end.
Yep.
Yeah, very excited to get back into this. You know,
me too.
we're recording this on a nice weekend morning. You know, I have a coffee, very cozy. It's very cozy vibe to be talking about Frankenstein.
Of course.
And let's get right into it with the age-old question that we always start this podcast with. Where are you at with your enjoyment of the book? How do you like it so far? Do you have any updated thoughts? What are the vibes of Frankenstein?
As you know, I was already hooked on this book to begin with, but especially after these chapters, it's like the direction for the story is like I'm kind of unsure as to where it's gonna go, but I like it because I feel like there's a lot of seeds being planted right now because we're still at the end of volume 1.
Yeah.
And I'm super excited to see where it goes. I want to get more context with the monster.
Yeah.
Because that's something we've only really had Victor's perspective of it. Obviously, the monster has his own perspective of everything that's happening, but we don't know anything about him yet. But yeah, I'm super excited to see what happens. Yeah, I'm like 100%. This is probably one of the best books I've ever read already. So yeah, I'm hooked.
Good. I'm glad you're still enjoying it. Yeah, it has been interesting, and you know, we'll even see in these chapters, like, the entirety of Act 1 is Victor, and kind of Victor's story, and it's all about kind of the character study of him, which is interesting, given that it's a third. Yeah, and when you add in the letters, more than a third of the book.
Yeah, exactly.
The total book. So, and there's only been a few instances of the monster even being alluded to or around. So it's an interesting choice that I think, if you know, my recollection serves me properly. I don't know. It's too early. Coffee hasn't hit yet. If my recollection is correct, I think really pays off nicely with how this goes. So let's get right into it. Let's start with talking about chapter 5.
Sure thing.
So as per usual, I take summaries. So, summary of Chapter 5. And just for some context, previously, Victor was in a coma.
Yes.
After
the creation.
Yeah, post the creation, that he worked kind of tirelessly and got himself sick. And obviously, this is the 1800s, so, like, when you get sick, you're just in a coma for a long time.
Exactly.
And maybe you survive, or maybe you don't. So, yeah, Victor has been in a coma. And so the summary for Chapter 5 is, Victor heals up after getting the town gossip from Elizabeth. He stays with Henry for a year before he's finally healthy enough to return home. Mm-hmm. So that's the main summary. I mean, the bulk of this chapter is actually a letter from Elizabeth to Victor.
Yeah.
Basically, like I said, outlining the town gossip. These are all the things that have happened since you've missed. It's very kind of historical and perfunctory. There's also a large section of this letter that goes into their servant, Justine, and like there's a whole history about Justine and what she's been up to and her trials and tribulations, which I mean, you know, I won't bury the lead here, but then in chapter 6 and 7 there's a subplot involving Justine. Not even a subplot, it becomes the main plot. And I totally forgot that happened.
Really?
Yeah, like from when I first read this in the 6th grade. So like when the letter was going on and on about Justine, I'm like, bro, like, who is this Justine person? Like, I don't, you know what I mean? Like, it's fine. But yeah, anyway, so chapter 5, let's get into it. What are your, do you have anything written down? Anything you'd like to discuss about chapter 5?
So with chapter 5, I remember something we talked about in large part in the last podcast was Victor's kind of back and forth and switching up on his studies. Like, oh, he was really invested and he really loved his studies. Then he detested it and he couldn't take it.
Yes.
And this chapter largely is like, it's the first time since this back and forth started where it's just kind of like discussed. Like after the creation of his monster, it's just like he can't stand his studies and he's just like really struggling with like what he's done.
Yeah.
And obviously that's shown, like you said, in the past year because he was so sick. But yeah, it's clear that if his love is to be regained at all for his studies, it clearly hasn't yet. So I think that was definitely something worth noting. That was kind of a switch up I saw.
Yeah, so we didn't, I didn't capture it in the summary, but the balance of this chapter after the letter, like the letter comes through, and then post Victor reading that letter, he's like, damn, I gotta heal up, you know?
Yeah.
He's like training montage for a year while he like regains his strength so he can go home and be with Elizabeth and his brothers. And but during that time, he's with Henry. Henry's just like living in Ingolstadt with him. And during that time, he basically takes Henry around to be like, these are my profs, or, you know, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, exactly like you said. There's both profs, actually. The one that he hates and the one that he likes, they're both like, I gotta give it up to Victor.
Yeah, exactly,
He's the absolute goat of science. Yeah. And Victor the whole time is like, oh,
yeah,
like,
exactly.
Don't. I wish I wasn't. I wish I wasn't the absolute goat of science. Yeah, which is cool. It's fun. It's like, you know, it is, it's one of those things. I don't know if we've talked about this yet on the podcast. Like, I know on the throughout the years I've been doing this podcast talking about like film stuff, this has definitely come up before. The conversation of like when you see something that feels perfunctory because you've seen it so many times in media, but you have to like reframe yourself to be like, no, this is the thing that invented it. So talking about the mad scientist trope, like the trope of the person that does the thing and then is like, oh, what have I done, and is so like distraught over it, feels like such a trope that we've seen a million times. I mean, literally, like Oppenheimer came out last summer, and it's like the exact, you know what I mean, and like, and that's based on real life events, but where the narrative of that takes its shape in the way is like leaning into this mad scientist archetype. But like, this is the mad scientist. This is it. This is the original, to really delve into the psychology of that. And I understand we can go back. I mean, it's called the modern Prometheus because of the character from mythology, Prometheus, who was, again, as we've said, tortured for doing this, stealing fire from the gods, and was tortured for it because, you know, that's what, because of his ambition and all that. But in those stories, it's more about like the fate of it. You know what I mean? It's not really like, this book takes a almost psychological lens at like the way that Victor is personally distraught for the things that he's done and how he feels about it, as opposed to this like universal punishment that he would deserve, which is just different because it shifts it to be more like character focused, which is then very modern, I think, in its storytelling.
I think so too. And there is still that notion of fate, like through destiny, that we did talk about that in the last podcast. But I know what you mean. Very focused on the character, very focused on what's actually happening.
So, and as we'll see, I mean, no spoilers for anything past chapter 7, but from what I remember of this book, the remaining balance of this book is a lot of like stuff happening to Victor where he's like, damn it, like I'm being punished for the things that I've done. So that still exists in here. But the fact that we keep getting to check in with Victor and have these moments with Victor where he is regretful and he is understanding, like, again, from that psychological perspective, that he's done a bad thing and that he regrets the bad thing that he's done. And we actually check in with that. And I won't spoil this for you because I know you've read a little bit ahead, but you haven't read ahead enough for what I say could have been a spoiler. So I'm going to hold back. But there's something, I believe it happens in Act 3, if I remember the structure of this right, where Victor kind of like has a choice about something that he could or could not do, and we fully see that choice be informed by where he's at right now. Like, sort of that end of Act 1 realization of the things that he's done. We fully see his choice in Act 3 be informed by that. I want to talk about the 3-act structure later, maybe at the end of this. But yeah, and that is interesting.
Okay.
So
I'm excited.
Yeah, I am excited. Yeah. It's so cool that, I know I ragged on the first 4 because I was saying that it felt a little bit muddled. Like, I like science, I don't. I like science, I don't. And, like, the motivations weren't as direct as they could have been.
Sure, yeah.
But, yeah, I feel like this chapter, I was kind of like, okay.
There's more of a foundation.
This is what I'm looking for in terms of, like, a character story from Victor, where it is a little bit more direct, and it is sort of like, now we're getting that psychological look at the regret for his actions and how that's going to inform his character throughout the rest of the book.
Yeah, for chapter 5 though, that's honestly a big chunk of it. Like we talked about, the letter from Justine, also Clerval coming to visit Victor. That was kind of surprising, but he's there for his own studies, and he's this dude is completely enthralled by everything that's happening. He's just so excited to learn. He's basically the reason that Victor... He clutched up. He's the reason that Victor was nursed back to health in the first place.
Yeah, he did. He really fixed his bed.
It's Clerval, an awesome friend, clutching up, end of chapter 5.
But is he a friend? Okay, so let me ask you this. Okay. I have one more... Not one. I have 2 more points of discussion for chapter 5.
Sure.
One thing that I want to point out because... just to say, good writing, Mary Shelley. And then... Also, though, one thing that I want to kind of read further into, if you will, if you don't mind me 100%. Doing that, because that's what we're here to do, right?
Yep.
All right. What I want to get into is the 4th last and the 3rd last paragraph from chapter 5.
Okay.
And I'll read it all out because I don't expect everybody that's listening to this to have a book in front of them, or it could be a different version, so I don't want to. But before I read those full things, I just want to read one line. Sure. And I want to talk about that one line, similar to something that we discussed before, and then I want to read the full thing and talk about a totally new topic, okay?
Go for it.
All right. Okay, so the one line, let's just start with this, and this is from the 3rd last paragraph, is, "Study had before secluded me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures, and rendered me unsocial, but Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature, the cheerful faces of children." So... I specifically wanted to read that line for the word intercourse because, as we discussed, with the conceive word choice.
Yep.
Okay. So, just, again, this is just, I think, a nice piece of writing, and you see this a lot in her writing, where she's using these words that make sense structurally in the sentence, but are maybe allusions to other things. So, the word intercourse and creature are both in that sentence, which... Again, we're talking about Victor that has, like, given birth to human life.
Yep.
Makes sense that would be in there. Nice little piece of word choice. Before I continue, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I feel like you pretty much captured it.
Okay, good. Yeah, that one was more just a shout-out.
Yeah, shout-out.
Yeah, shout-out to Mary Shelley. Yeah, shout-out Mary Shelley for being a fantastic writer. Okay. Now I want to read the paragraph before and that full paragraph, including that word choice. Sure. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to read to the end of the chapter. So okay. I'm going to read from the thing before, from the 4th last paragraph all the way to the end of the chapter.
All right.
And then we'll talk about it.
Sounds good.
Okay?
Yep.
The month of May had already commenced, and I expected the letter daily which was to fix the date of my departure, when Henry proposed a pedestrian tour in the environs of Ingolstadt that I might bid a personal farewell to the country I had so long inhabited. I acceded with pleasure to this proposition. I was fond of exercise, and Clerval had always been my favorite companion in the rambles of this nature that I had taken among the scenes of my native country. We passed a fortnight in these... Don't know that word. My health and spirits had long been restored, and they gained additional strength from the salubrious air I breathed, the natural incidents of our progress, and the conversations of my friend. Study had before secluded me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures and rendered me unsocial, but Clerval called forth better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature, the cheerful faces of children. Excellent friend, how sincerely did you love me and endeavor to elevate my mind until it was on a level with your own. A selfish pursuit had cramped and narrowed me until your gentleness and affection warmed and opened my senses. I became the same happy creature who, a few years ago, loving and beloved by all, had no sorrow or care. When happy, inanimate nature had the power of bestowing on me the most delightful sensations. A serene sky and a verdant fields filled me with ecstasy. The present season was indeed divine. The flowers of spring bloomed with the hedges, while those of summer were already in bud. I was undisturbed by thoughts which, during the preceding year, had pressed upon me, notwithstanding my endeavors to throw them off with an invincible burden. Henry rejoiced in my gaiety, and sincerely sympathized in my feelings. He exerted himself to amuse me, while he expressed the sensation that filled his soul. The resources of his mind on this occasion were truly astonishing. His conversation was full of imagination, and very often, in imitation of the Persian and Arabic writers, he invented tales of wonderful fancy and passion. At other times, he repeated my favorite poems, or drew me out into arguments which he supported with great ingenuity. We returned to college on a Sunday afternoon, the peasants were dancing, and everyone we met appeared gay and happy. My own spirits were high, and I bounded along with feelings of unbridled joy and hilarity. All right. Do you know what I want to talk about here?
Not particularly, to be honest.
Okay. What I would like to talk about here is something that I think as we get a little bit more modern in culture, there's been an interesting thing, and I remember even when I was your age in an English class, and oftentimes we would have these discussions. Actually, when I was in Dr. Broad's English class, there was something we read, I literally can't remember what it is, and they made a movie off of it, where at the time, it was read as like, oh, a story between two best friends. But then the whole discussion that we had in that English class was like, but is this meant to be like a gay relationship? Mm-hmm. Like, are these people meant to like actually be in a romantic love relationship? Right. But because of the nature of when it was written, mm-hmm. it was referred to as a friendship. But then, English literature kind of historians and professors and those things go back and they read it and they go, well, actually, if you look at some of the way in which things are being described in this, the nature of it could mean that this is supposed to be a gay relationship, right?
Yeah.
So these last 4 paragraphs at the end of chapter 5, mm-hmm. there's just a lot in there that makes me think that in terms of the writing and the description of it, like, I wonder if there is a reading of this that Victor and Henry are gay and that this is almost like their chance to have a little bit of a relationship with each other, or that maybe they always did. There is also so much in this book that has to do with like Victor's resentment of his father and like his father's wishes of him.
Yep.
This is also a book about creation. And obviously there are more options now for like a gay couple to be together and still raise a child or something like that. But in the 1800s, there really wouldn't be. Mm-hmm. And so is there some reading into this of like, well, potentially that Victor's relationship with this guy, and then he is so inspired to like create a thing? Like we talked about, well, is the inspiration to create the thing because of the death that he experienced of his mother and et cetera, and is it death on the mind? Is it like bringing somebody back from the dead?
Right.
But if we look through these chapters, these paragraphs in this chapter, is there maybe a reading that creation isn't to do with bringing someone back from the dead, but it's almost like, well, I could never have a child of my own with Henry.
Right.
Or with anybody, but I'm saying Henry because that's the person that we see that relationship with right now.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way.
So just to pull, some things from here that kind of like led me to have that reading, and then as I reread it a few times, right? Mm-hmm. So, it starts, I was fond of exercise. Clerval had always been my favorite companion, and the rambles of this nature I had taken among the scenes of my native country, so clearly they have sort of like a background with that. Now that on its own is like, okay, they're friends, they exercise together, whatever, no big deal. Obviously there's a line about intercourse, which I brought up before in a different context, but, study had secluded me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures.
Right.
Yada, yada, yada. Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart in the same line about intercourse. He taught me to love. There's one reference of the word love. Excellent friend. How sincerely did you love me? There's the other thing of the word love. Mm-hmm. Until it was on a level of your own. Your gentleness and affection warmed and opened my senses. Okay. A serene sky and verdant fields filled me with ecstasy. There's another reference to something that could be romantic love. And then you have this line, which, I mean, not an explicit reference to romantic love, but if I told you this line was written in a romance novel, it would make sense, right?
Yeah.
The present season was indeed divine. The flowers of spring bloomed in the hedges, while those summer were already in bud. I was undisturbed by thoughts which during the preceding year had pressed upon me, notwithstanding my endeavors to throw them off in invincible burden, right? He's talking about, like, he feels this burden has been lifted, and he's just, like, he's seeing the world around him, and et cetera, et cetera. Henry rejoiced in my gaiety. There's also another reference to the word gay later, like in another paragraph. The one immediately preceding this. Now, I don't know that... I understand that the history of that word is that it used to mean, like, happy. I don't know at what point that word was also used to describe, like, a homosexual relationship, but if the history of that lines up with this, where it could have a double meaning and it could be either, the fact that she used the word twice in 2 paragraphs, and it's also the same paragraphs where we're talking about love and affection and gentleness and this and that, and we're using the word intercourse, and we're talking about all these different things.
It's a pretty meaningful word choice.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, that's a very modern reading. But if historically that word could have meant both back then, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know when it started to mean both. That would be a very specific word choice. He exerted himself to amuse me while he expressed the sensations that filled his soul. Like, what are we even... Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is so... Like, I don't know. So, yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Because...
Am I crazy?
On like, looking through your eyes right now, no, you don't seem crazy. It's just that because of how Elizabeth and his relationship with her has been built up, I just never really considered this being an option. But, like...
But think about it like this. In the last chapter, in chapter 4, we talked about how there's that line in there about how this is like his last chance to escape like his dead wife, and he's alluding to the story of Sinbad or whatever, but then there's the reading of that like him getting home and getting married is in reference to like the death of his life in some way. Right? Like he has rejected, in some senses, always sort of rejected the things that his father wanted to put on him.
Yes.
And so I agree with you that it is a little bit muddled because he does seem to have genuine affection for Elizabeth, but at the same time seems to not want to be married.
Yes, that's right.
So, like, what's that about?
Yeah. I mean, this whole section provides a pretty valid alternate explanation, I guess, then. Like, yeah, I can totally see that. I can totally see that these references, like, adding up in that way. But yeah, I never considered that. That's actually really insightful.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it's interesting. It's just a fun little reading of it. And I don't... Again, I could be totally out of my mind, and maybe this is something that's been, like, thoroughly disputed by the scholars of this book, but... Yeah, rereading it again and then rereading those paragraphs a few times. Once I had the idea in my head and then I reread those paragraphs, I was like, oh, there's kind of like an undertone here and a reading here, and it actually, I think, fits in with the creation myth more than the dead mother thing.
Right.
Like, I actually think it fits better than that if you read it that way. But who knows if that's author intention or if that's just a very kind of postmodern reading. I don't know. But either way, interesting.
That is very interesting. I'm excited to see.
I mean, I think the easiest way to say, like, you're crazy and that's not the reading at all is, as we know, like, this book was written in the Romantic era, and I think a lot of that language that's being used just, like, is language of the time.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not... I think it's very easily just, like, you could say, no, you're reading too much into it. These guys were just best friends. But it's one of those things, and I know, our sister Clementine and we joke about this all the time, but, like, whenever you go back and look at a really old piece of work and it's like, and these two guys were just the bestest friends that have ever been best friends, there's always that flag that goes up nowadays that's like, oh, but what's the author's intention?
Yeah,
like, were they trying to allude to something else? It just makes for interesting postmodern reading.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. That's pretty cool.
Any other thoughts on chapter 5?
Not really. That's pretty much it, to be honest. No, those are some insightful points. I could give my quick little summary of chapter 6 to bring us into that, though.
Sure.
So for chapter 6, it starts off with Victor receiving another letter, except this time it's not from Elizabeth, it's from his father. And the most important information in this is that William was murdered. That's Victor's youngest brother. Or youngest or middle brother? I forget exactly.
William?
Yeah.
I think he's the youngest.
Youngest, okay. So he was murdered. Everyone believed that Justine, the girl we talked about in the last chapter, committed the murder based on the evidence they have now. Only Victor and Elizabeth believe it's not Justine as of this point in the story. This is something that I want to also clarify as well. So Victor leaves Clerval and finally takes his journey home because he's healthy enough to do that.
Yeah.
On his way home, he stops one night in a thunderstorm, and he appears to see his creation in the dead of night.
Yeah.
It described, I think, as lightning coming down and striking something, and in that moment he saw, like, his creature.
Yeah.
And he was describing, he was like, his proportions were uneven and this and that, and he was kind of just, like, describing him, and it was definitely alluding to his creation. And then, Victor, with no evidence to confirm it, believes that his creation, murdered his brother.
Yeah.
He was, like, immediately, as soon as that happened, he was like, there's no way that this innocent girl, Justine, could have done this. This has to be my creation. And he was very, like, stuck on that. But yeah, that was basically the chapter. Victor's going to have to come home now and kind of face that head on with his family. So
yeah.
That's pretty much chapter 6.
Okay, what's your question before we... I think you got the key points, so what's your question?
I think that there's one in storyline, and then there's one of, like, just for Victor, I was just thinking about. So for the actual story, it's mentioned that Victor comes back from Ingolstadt to his family, but it never mentions what happens to Clerval at this point in the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, because I've read a bit ahead, I know he comes back later.
Yeah.
But for now anyway, it just kind of seemed like there was all this build-up with Clerval, especially to the points you just said. You're a very, very important person to him.
Yeah.
And it just kind of seems like, oh, he's leaving him. And then Clerval's just gone now for, like, a long time. And I'm like, oh, that was kind of sudden.
Yeah.
He's just really not involved in this part of the story. I wish there was kind of a line where, like, oh, Clerval was here. Clerval stayed in Ingolstadt to focus on the studies, or just something. Because it kind of seems like it was really abrupt and he didn't bring him with him. So I kind of wish that was clarified a little bit, but...
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point. When I was reading chapter 6, about halfway through, I was like, wait a minute. And I went back and restarted chapter 6 because I was very confused if we were supposed to think... Not very confused. That's an overexaggeration. I'm not that stupid. But about halfway through, I was like, the language using to describe Victor's journey is as if he's by himself.
Yes, exactly.
So then I went back and I was like, is there a line where we establish that Clerval isn't on the journey? And I don't think there is.
No, yeah, I don't think so either.
Which I agree is weird.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there should probably be a line about that. And it's fine. I mean, like you said, it comes back, like, spoiler alert, he will come back later in the story. But, yeah, just an odd choice that we don't clarify. Victor's like, maybe Clerval wants to go with him, and Victor's like, no, like, this is a journey I have to take on my own. Like, you just got here. You need to...
Right.
You need to now live your life here the way I did. You know, I mean, again, that's very, very modern, but, like, something to that effect.
Exactly.
As opposed to me being confused on whether Clerval is just a silent companion on this trip.
Yeah.
Which he's not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for
weird.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And then pertaining to Victor, this is just something I wrote down for my thoughts when reading this. How could he prove his suspiciousness to his family without sounding crazy? It's like... to come back and have his family have no idea that he made the non-living living again.
Yeah.
And to say, oh, this is what murdered my brother, his family would be tweaking. Like, there's just no way he could do that.
Yeah, of course.
So, yeah. And in my mind, just reading that, I was like, yeah, I don't know how Victor's going to pull this off, but he's got to do something to prove that she's innocent. But
well, yeah. I mean, that is a good takeaway. I think now would be a good time to talk about something that the annotations brought up earlier in the book, and I didn't want to talk about it then. I don't even really want to talk about it now, but we should. I mean, we're trying to cover this in depth and talk about lots of different things and interpretations, right? Yeah. So there is a very, very postmodern interpretation of this book that I think is really dumb and takes away from the story, which is basically that Victor never actually reanimated the dead and has just lost his mind, and then, like, seeks to explain a lot of the things that will end up happening in the book. And I won't spoil all of it for you, but there's a lot of other times where the creature, like, has direct interactions with things, and then seeks to explain those things by other means. Of, like, well, we can explain that this happened because of that, or because maybe Victor did it, and he's just totally projecting that it was the creature. Like, he's completely lost his mind. Which, you know, there are some things that you can point to and say that, okay, like, for example, we talked about the chapter where the creature is reanimated.
Yep.
That Frankenstein just goes to bed. And then he wakes up and he's like, he sees the creature there and then he leaves, but then the creature isn't there anymore in the morning.
Right.
And also, you know, people point to, well, when Henry comes back to Victor's apartment that afternoon for the first time, we make no reference to Victor having cleaned up this year of work that he's done. And Henry never says anything. So what's up with that? You know? Like, was there actually a lab with blood and dead body parts and all this stuff? And, like, if there is, why wasn't Henry like, hey man,
Yeah.
what was going on here? So there's like that, and then I think getting into this story, like he never interacts with the creature there. It's sort of like he thinks he sees the creature, and he's so committed to like just because he thinks he sees it that he's like, well, it must have been the creature that did it.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we get to then Justine, and a little bit of a spoiler for something in chapter 7, which we're talking about in this episode anyway, so not like spoiler, but just to jump ahead. As a part of Justine's story, she mentions, like, I don't know how the kid's locket got in my pocket, because... Damn it, I rhymed. I don't know how that happened, because, like, there was no time for it to have happened.
Yes.
I was awake the whole night, I couldn't fall asleep, and then whatever, so how did it get there? Which, again, people are like, yeah, because it wasn't actually the creature that did it. You know, Victor thinks that because he's losing his mind. Like, he just... So... I think that reading is so dumb.
I think that's to miss the point of a lot of the story.
Yeah, I mean, it fundamentally misses the point.
Yeah.
Like, and I think, you know, people get really mad, like, with the reading I did earlier of the Henry stuff. People get mad about that because they're like, oh, like, why are you trying to insert that into a piece of art? And I'm like, but...
It's pretty out there.
If anything, it also actually, like, helps explain themes of the stories more.
Very much so.
Whereas... saying this is all in Victor's head is the most reductive reading of this book that I think a person could have. Like, there's nothing interesting in that reading because it, other than, oh, this guy's crazy. Like, that is the beginning and ending of that interpretation of the story. I think it's so it's why I didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
But because you brought up, well, what the heck is Victor's plan? Like, he just sees this creature and he thinks he can, like, blame it on him, and he thinks he knows that it's it. Like,
right.
You know, I thought this was as good a time as any to bring that reading of the story up. But yeah, so you don't like that reading either?
Oh no, that's just like, what? How can you argue that? That's just
it's ridiculous. I absolutely hate that.
I guess it kind of fits with the fact that he's losing his mind, but no. Like I have read a little bit too, and for no spoiler, just with the context we get from the monster, there's just no way that such a significant
chunk of the book.
Yeah, chunk of the book is focused on nothing. Like, there's just no way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's
there's
crazy.
No way.
And then also, it's like for them to say, well, we don't find out when Victor cleaned up the mess of his lab, and Henry never said anything about it. Okay, but Mary Shelley also didn't write an explicit line where Henry isn't on the trip with Victor. Like we just said.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like, and not like a genuine criticism of her writing, but there are just some things where she's like, I don't even want to dedicate a line to that. Mm-hmm. You will figure out Henry's not on this journey. Like... And if that's the case, okay, yeah, we can just figure out and assume that the lab got cleaned up. Or if it didn't, that Henry saw it and was like, that's weird. And then, like, it never came up or Victor never told him. Like, we can just assume that. There's a lot, again, we talked about this before. Like, she does this all the time in her writing where there's so many things where you would expect the one direct line to address the thing. And she's like, no. Like, I'm not going to give you that line.
Right.
Which, and sometimes I think it works well, and there are other times where I'm like, I could have used the direct line. But to take those omissions of those direct lines and then have a reading of it that is so, like, reductive and, like, well, if that line's not there, then it must literally mean that there was a mess, and if there wasn't literally a mess, then that must have meant that there was never a mess at all because Henry would have addressed it. Like, that's not anything.
Yeah,
like,
no.
There's 1,000 times in this book where she writes things that you think would be addressed and aren't.
Yes.
So I don't know why you would take that reading of it.
Yeah, no. Yeah, that is yeah. I absolutely hate that reading, but I mean, I'm glad you mentioned it though, just to put it out there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to cover, you know,
yeah,
on this little book club series we're doing for this book. I mean, especially a book that is so, like, has ingrained its way so much into pop culture, where, like, there are different movies and the movies have different takes, and there are all these essays that people have written that have different takes. Like, this is a famous piece of literature. Like, there is endless amounts of people's interpretations and takes, and the annotations clearly show that, and, you know, there's so much to get into that, yeah, I would like to at least, throughout the course of this podcast, like, if we can talk about those specific things, and you know,
100%, yeah,
and how it influenced, again, like, more modern looks or essays or works of fiction in and of themselves, like different movies, and even the Hulk, you know, I just pointed as if this is a visual podcast. It's not. I have a picture of the Hulk first issue that I have framed on the wall. Yeah, and, like, it's such a clear reference to this as well, and like you know, there's so much we can get into that I hope by the end of this we'll be able to talk about it more. But yeah, just something worth bringing up. Do you have anything else for chapter 6 so far?
Those are pretty much all of my points, to be honest. Do you have any lines that stood out to you?
Yeah.
Or anything?
Yeah, I have a few things I want to bring up.
Sure.
First of all, I just want to talk about. I thought a lot of the descriptions, and I'm not going to read it because it's kind of boring to just have me sit here and read the whole book to you guys. But I thought a lot of the descriptions of Victor going home and on his journey back were really interesting because it really was described with such a like loss of innocence, like the loss of innocence trope or archetype or whatever you want to call it. But the idea that like this place that was his childhood and he's coming back to it as a changed person.
Yeah.
And making all these allusions to like these things that he remembers and how they're different now. And just good writing. Like just that's another, Mary Shelley shout out. That's what the section is going to be called. It's the Mary Shelley shout outs. But a nice little literary device for this biggest change in his life to have happened when he's not home. And now he's like trying to go back home, and the famous line about, you can never really go home. Like what's that in reference to is loss of innocence, like loss of your childhood. Like he is a man now who's done a thing who will have to carry the ramifications of that thing with him forever. And on this journey back and seeing those sights and the things that he remembers, everything is different and it's wrong. And there's another literary device we'll get into on that journey as well. Actually, we'll just talk about it right now. Do you know what the literary device is called where like the weather reflects what's going on narratively?
No, I've never heard of that before.
You've never heard of that?
No. Sorry, Dr. Broad, if you taught that, but...
I'm sure she taught that to you. Well, I'm 100% sure you did talk about it. The literary device is called a pathetic fallacy.
Yeah, we definitely did.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. I was going to say, that's like, I'm pretty sure every year of English I took in high school, we talked at least for 17 weeks about the pathetic fallacy. That was like the number one thing. Yeah, but I usually, so on the movie and TV episodes of this podcast, I often talk about how much I hate, not the use of a pathetic fallacy, but I hate when a character calls out a pathetic fallacy. So, like, there are so many times where a character in a movie or TV show will be like at the end, or as we get to the end of the second act, will be like, oh man, like, there's a big storm coming, or like, there's a big storm brewing.
Yeah.
And it's such a, like, just show the big storm.
Yeah.
Like, the literary device would be to just show it. I don't need the character in the scene to be like, that big storm.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But just funny that I think there's a really good example of that here, which is that on this journey, as he's making his way back home, and the day that he sees the creature, but he's talking about all these sights that he remembers and stuff, that there is this massive storm happening. Just a nice use of the pathetic fallacy.
For sure.
Shout out.
Shout out, yeah.
Mary Shelley shout outs. Okay, so here's one that I like in this. It's actually before he starts his journey home when he's talking to Henry.
Okay.
So this is a line from Henry where he's basically saying, this is after we found out William is dead, and Henry's found out, and he's really distraught about it, and he's trying to comfort Victor, and he says, those maxims of the Stoics, that death was no evil, and that the mind of man ought to be superior to despair on the eternal absence of the beloved object, ought not to be urged. Okay, do you have any context for that?
No, not really.
Do you have any thoughts on that as I've said it?
Not really, to be honest.
Okay, so here's what the annotation says. Clerval here refers to the philosophers of the later school of Stoicism, principally Seneca and Epictetus.
Of course.
Yes, sorry, Dad, if you're reading this. I have no idea how to pronounce that guy's name. He lived from 55 to 135 CE, so you know who I'm talking about. The Stoics held that the external events were determined by fate, not by the actions of the individuals, and that the only proper response of the philosopher to good fortune or disaster was calm, passionless acceptance. Okay, here's why this is relevant. Because this line in the 1818, I'll read it again, those maxims of the Stoics, that death was no evil and that the mind of man ought to be superior to despair on the eternal absence of a beloved object, ought not to be urged, is basically Henry saying, nah, like, the Stoics are wrong. But the Stoics' whole thing is that, well, if external defense events are determined by fate and not by the actions of the individuals, really what this line is saying through the character of Henry is telling Victor that you need to take, like, a free will approach to looking at this, and as a part of that, you need to, like, actually grieve the death of what's going on here, which is so interesting because, as we have discussed ad nauseum, but what's so interesting is in the 1831 revisions by Mary Shelley, that she becomes effectively a Stoic, because she's all about determinism and fate, and that Victor, the things that happened to Victor should have happened to him because of fate and not because of his actions, and that he's actually a victim in the story.
Right.
And it's so fascinating to me, because there is a explicit line in the book where this massively important character of Henry, who Victor adores and who is like the godsend of Victor's life, is explicitly being like, no, they were wrong.
Yeah.
That's not the case.
That is pretty interesting.
And then her worldview just 180s, like, by the time you get to her 1831 revision on the book. So, very interesting.
That's pretty crazy, yeah.
So this is kind of an interesting one. And this one is more of a, it's not like, there's not going to be a lot to talk about right now. But this is I'm throwing this up there as like a first act setup. Sure. And it'll get paid off. Okay?
All right.
So there's a scene after Victor returns home. He goes into his dad's study, right? And he sees the painting on the wall of his mom.
Yes.
Do you remember what the image of the painting was? Just by chance?
Was it the mom with one of the kids?
No.
No?
No.
I forgot.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
The image is actually of the mom kneeling by the coffin of her dead father, who was the dad's best friend, Buford.
Oh, okay.
That's what the image was. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so this annotation here says, this is an odd choice of circumstances in which to depict a lover, emphasizing, as it does, the near incestuous relationship between Alphonse and Caroline. Alphonse is Victor's dad.
Yeah.
So basically what it's saying is, it's weird that Victor's dad, like how he wants to remember the mother, the picture of the mother that's in the study of his wife,
right,
is his wife kneeling over his best friend's grave.
Yeah.
Very odd choice.
Yeah, that is.
Okay, so in and of itself, very odd choice. Before I want to talk about that choice, I will say, and the reason I wanted to write this annotation down is because this gets paid off at the end of the book.
Okay.
In Volume 3, there is a reference or allusion to this.
To, like, this specific painting?
Not to the painting, but to...
Like, the relationship?
Kind of.
Yeah.
We'll get into it.
Sure.
To the imagery of it.
Okay.
There's a reference to the imagery of it in Volume 3.
Sure.
So, I want to bring that up. I honestly wrote this down even somewhat as a note to myself to remember when we get to Volume 3 to be like, hey, what was that? And let's go back and we can discuss further. But I don't want to spoil that for you. So,
all right.
Before we get... Well, obviously we can't talk about it yet. So before we have that conversation at the end of Volume 3, just like in general, you know, do you have a reading of like why that would be the painting that Victor's dad has? Let's just take a moment. Let's think about it. I understand that there's going to be a more informed by the text reading later, but it's fun to like, can you think about from a character perspective, not from a narrative perspective, right? I think narratively, the reason this is in here is because it's going to get paid off in Act 3.
Right.
The imagery of it's going to get paid off in Act 3. But character-wise about Alphonse, Victor's dad, what does it tell us?
I feel like, just to confirm before I say anything else, Victor's dad, Alphonse, his wife was his best friend's daughter?
Yeah.
That's right, okay. So, that is... Just hearing that for the first time, that's really weird. But I feel like it was clear that her father's death was something that was really hard on her, like Alphonse's wife, because it was stated that she nursed her father for like a really long time, and he wasn't doing well at all, and he just kept getting worse, and she was just getting by and had just enough food to give to him and to her, and the death of her father like was completely like, it just made her completely distraught. I feel like she gave so much to that relationship, and just for the first time anyway, my first interpretation of actually looking at this is just that Alphonse has the memory of his wife showing appreciation for something she gave so much time into.
Yeah.
Like, maybe shows dedication to the fact that she stuck with her father until the very end. And yes, it's sad that she's kneeling beside his grave and she's grieving, but she was very, determined, and she was very hardworking, and she was very passionate and caring, and maybe that kind of, like, solidifies some of the things that he was thinking about her, like her passion, her compassion, maybe that was what drew her to him. But that is...
Him to her,
sorry, yeah. But that is kind of... Out of all the pictures you could show to show your passion for your wife or lover, that's just It is kind of a weird choice.
Okay,
so
so I think you've arrived at the same place I arrived at in terms of why, because of the dedication and the caring, but now let's take this a step further.
Okay.
Let's bring up something we talked about on the previous episode, which is this is a book written by a woman, primarily. Written by a woman, I understand. Percy Shelley added a line here or there, whatever. They probably talked about it. I get it. But, like, this is a book primarily written by a woman, so we should look at this from, like, a modern feminist lens as well. So,
for sure.
What is the significance of this female woman writer writing that this male character is choosing to remember his wife that way by that trait? Because I'm with you, I think that's the trait. The trait is, oh, she's so caring. She stood by this guy to the very end. That's, of all the things I could remember her for and have a painting of, I could remember her as a mother, I could remember her by a moment that we had, but what I choose to remember her for is the way she took care of her father.
Yes.
Okay, what's the significance of a woman writing that about a man? What changes when you put on your feminist glasses and you look at it from that lens? I'm gonna grab some water while you think.
Sure,
about
yeah.
This. Take your time. I mean, I could just sit here and tell you what I think.
Yeah,
but this
I
is
do
for
wanna
your
think about
this
it,
is for
yeah.
your English class, so
Yeah.
I want you to like take the time. And I'll be right back.
Yep.
All right, I've
No,
returned
this-
from getting my water.
Yeah.
For the listener, that will sound like no time has passed, but it's been approximately a half hour. So no, I'm just kidding. It hasn't been that long. Okay, what do you think?
Yeah. So okay, yeah, this is kind of tricky for me, but if I did have to think about this, I would say that there was definitely still the idea of like the small nuclear family. You know what that is? Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
I know the nuclear fan.
Okay, just making sure. Okay.
You think I came up with all this insightful criticism and I've never heard of the nuclear family? Yeah, I know what the nuclear family is. Okay.
So
go
yeah,
on.
we actually learned about that in history class, and just thinking about that, during this time, proceeding the 1800s, that was obviously there was started to make a big shift towards that, but particularly now, I feel like it was definitely still like, you know, large families, male like rule of the house, and it was like largely governed that way, and it was I remember learning that often the male figure was kind of someone to be like intimidated by. Like if you did not listen to him, there was repercussions. He was the leader of the house, be all and end all. That was it. And seeing her relationship towards her father, like in that way, like how she actually grieved him, that makes me think that he wasn't kind of that typical intimidating figure.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll let you continue. Before I just want to remember, just to clarify, I'm asking why, and maybe you're going to get to this, but from the lens of Mary Shelley.
Okay.
Like, what's she trying to say? Now, I'm not looking at it from the character. Like, the character's perspective, whatever. I get it. Like, this is exactly what you said.
Yeah.
It's that Victor's dad sees her in that way, and et cetera, et cetera. But, like, what is Mary Shelley's point of view on relationships, on men, on whatever, for her to choose? It's a choice.
Yeah.
As we've said, everything in writing is a choice.
Yeah.
She had to sit down and decide what Victor was going to see when he went into her father's study.
Right.
And what Victor saw was this.
Mm-hmm.
So she chose that. She chose that because she's trying to say something. What is she trying to say about her worldview? What is her worldview of marriage, of men, of relationships, of fathers, of whatever? I mean, you can take it from whatever angle you want.
I feel like-
what's her worldview?
And
As a 16-year-old
Yeah.
white man, 17-year-old
Yeah.
white man, what do you think Mary Shelley's worldview was in 1818?
and the context of the relationship between Victor's mom and her father, I think that, you know, I feel like Mary Shelley would have had a father who was really like nurturing and caring in that way.
Okay.
Because I feel like to depict her grieving in that way about her father, that was like, yeah, I don't think that was by accident. I feel like she was definitely influenced by some male figures in her life. If not her father, then maybe by her husband. Just that nurturing and caring thing. If she were to lose him, how like distraught she would have been, kind of representing that.
Is that it?
Yeah, I don't know.
So here's my take. Here's my take on this, right? I think you're still looking at it from the perspective of why did Mary write her name was Caroline? Why did Mary write Caroline to be that way?
Mm-hmm.
Is how I think you're still approaching it. Like, why did she write Caroline to be a caregiver or whatever,
Yeah.
take care of her father, right? So, yeah, from that stance, sure, maybe you could think of maybe Mary's relationship with her own father, and she's writing about that, about how she would have or maybe did take care of her own father. Maybe it's her relationship with her husband, how she would have or did take care of her husband. You know, I don't know the inner workings of Mary Shelley's life. So, I mean, I know some historical inner workings, but not to that degree. So, like, sure, I'm with you that maybe she depicted the character of Caroline to be that way for that reason. But I think the more interesting, like, way to view it is not, it's not like, why did she choose to depict Caroline that way? It's why did she choose to depict Alphonse as memorializing Caroline in that way.
Okay.
Right? So what I'm saying is, why is Alphonse's most important takeaway of Caroline that? And if I had to look at it in any particular way, my reading of it would be, because I think Mary Shelley is probably, I don't even know if criticizing is the word, but at least hanging a lamp, that's the expression, right? Hanging a lamppost? I don't know. Light post?
Something like
whatever.
that. I don't know.
Whatever. I think she's calling attention to, like, that as a woman in that time period, the trait above all else that, like, you will be respected for is being a caregiver.
Okay.
Now, again, this is 1818, and I don't think this is, I mean, this is a really beautiful piece of literature. I don't think anything in it necessarily holds up as, like, a specific piece of feminist literature where, like, it would be heralded in that way. So it's hard for me to say whether or not the inclusion of that from that feminist lens is, like, her saying this is a bad thing. Like, we're supposed to take away from that, like, that Alphonse is the only thing he was ever interested in was her caregiver aspect and never got to know her. Like, if it's supposed to be negative, or if it's supposed to be more of a positive, like, it's good to be a caregiver.
Right.
Like, that is the thing in life that as a woman you will be known for. Now, I take objection to reading it that way because of the fact that she did, and at the time was doing these, like, groundbreaking things of writing this book and trying to get it published under her own name and all that. So I don't think that's the reading of it, is that it's a good thing. And also, like, throughout the book, Alphonse is depicted through Victor's eyes as being, like, Victor is resentful of him.
Yeah.
So I do think it's meant to signify something negative about Alphonse, that, like, he chose to memorialize and remember his wife not for their relationship, not for her relationship with her children, not for anything in particular that she did other than being a devout caregiver.
Right. Okay.
And, like, what that means as a woman in 1818.
Yeah.
So I think personally that's my reading of why she chose that image. And then literally in the text, that iconography, that imagery will return in Act 3. But the symbolism of that choice here, I think, is meant to tell us something about Alphonse and the way that he views women and his relationships and things of that nature.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
All right.
It's pretty insightful. That's heading into the end of chapter 6, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is the end. Do you have any more thoughts on chapter 6?
No, I feel like we've covered that pretty thoroughly.
Okay, so let's get into
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7. So, Chapter 7, quick summary. Justine, who is the person that is believed to be guilty of killing William.
Yep.
And the reason she's believed to be guilty is because somebody found William's locket that was around his neck in her pocket. Oh, damn it. In her pocket.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Chapter 7 is she's on trial. It's
Yeah.
literally just the trial, and she is found guilty. And Victor and Elizabeth pay her a visit, and they have sort of one last conversation together where they kind of admit, and they come to the conclusion, like, we know you're not guilty. Yeah, and she's put to death for it, for the killing of William, even though she's innocent. And Victor is completely distraught.
Yeah, he's tweaking.
Yeah. All right, hit me. What are your thoughts?
That was, like, up until this point in the book, probably one of the hardest chapters to read, because for Victor, that's just, like, of course he has no evidence that his creation would have committed the murder, but to have such an assurance of something and be able to not provide evidence for it and the life of somebody's on the line, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I felt his pain through the text. I was like, wow, like, and he even said at one point he had to take a step out of the courtroom. Like, I was like, yeah, I would have to too. That's a really insane thing to have to deal with and think about and not be able to say to anybody. And somebody's life is on the line. The most interesting part to me was towards the end of the chapter, and I think it was just really, really good writing. And it was when it was Victor, Elizabeth, and Justine, and this was before Justine was going to be condemned to death. And Elizabeth, Victor, and her were having one last like mini conversation that you mentioned before the end of the chapter. And there was, let me see if I can pull up the text really quickly. And basically, we find out that near the end of the court case that there was no hope. And despite Elizabeth coming to Justine's defense, and despite everything else that was happening, she was so heavily prosecuted that Justine knew. She was like, I'm going to be condemned to death. There's no stopping this. So she ended up confessing guilty.
Yep.
And in their last visit, Elizabeth was basically just telling her, like, tell me this isn't true. Like, I can only live the rest of my life in peace and innocence knowing that you were not guilty of this.
Yeah.
And she basically goes on to tell her, like, yeah, I am guilty. Like, I only said what I said because I knew there was literally just no hope. It had to be over. And it was after that Justine told Elizabeth that, or confirmed her innocence to Elizabeth, that she said this. As we returned, Elizabeth said, "You know not, my dear Victor, how much I am relieved, now that I trust in the innocence of this unfortunate girl. I never could again have known peace if I had been deceived in my reliance on her. For the moment that I did believe her guilty, I felt an anguish that I could not have long sustained. Now my heart is lightened. The innocent suffers, but she, whom I thought amiable and good, has not betrayed the trust I reposed in her, and I am consoled." And then in this response, this is the last little sentence or two of the chapter, Victor says, "Amiable cousin, such were your thoughts, mild and gentle as your own dear eyes and voice. But I was a wretch," book's favorite word, and none...
We need a wretch counter in there.
we do. And none ever conceived of the misery that I then endured. So that word again, conceived, right?
Yep.
So, yeah, just in that last paragraph, because of the setup of this chapter, I feel like there's just so much. We get the word wretch, which is going to be used a lot more going into volume 2, which happens directly after this chapter.
Yep.
Was never conceived of the misery that I endured. He took part in creating this misery he endured. Obviously, we talked about that aspect of creation, and that's why that word choice of conceive is so significant. And Elizabeth talked about, for the moment I did believe her guilty, I felt an anguish that I could not have long sustained, and that kind of hit me because Elizabeth is basically saying, like, I could not live if this feeling I have toward Justine was not, like, resolved, if it was not said right. And to Victor, it's like he's having no piece of this. Like, it's this is kind of hard for me to say, but just seeing how Elizabeth would have felt if Justine was actually guilty, it just makes me think of how Victor's currently feeling.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
no result could have changed how Victor's feeling. He's just completely destroyed.
Yep.
And to just see that she's okay, and to see him just completely shattered by this is like, it's really wrenching, I guess, but
really
to put it that way. But yeah, I just thought that was like really well written, and it really shows the contrast in how Elizabeth and Victor are feeling up until this point.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was but yeah, as you said, that was the court case chapter. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I have lots. So
Sure,
first of all, let's stick with what you brought up. Yeah, I mean, it's a great. I think you read that exactly how I read it, right? It's a good. There's a couple different things at play. I mean, one is the whole literary device idea, sort of like finding out about the protagonist through side characters, and I think we get that here because everything Elizabeth is talking about, exactly like you said, is what Victor's current state is.
Yes.
Because at least, okay, I mean, again, we can put the did Victor imagine the creature aside.
Yeah.
What we are meant to believe that Victor is 100% certain it was the creature that did this.
Yep.
And we're locked in on that, right? And if we're following the book from Victor's perspective, then sure, we're going to believe that. And so given that, and given that there was no real resolution to this, and that Justine maintained her innocence until she died, it it does follow that exactly what you're saying, that Victor would be in that place that Elizabeth talked about potentially being in and explained so eloquently, but he can't do that because he would sound like a crazy person.
Yeah, exactly.
If he said that he brought someone back to life and then 2 years later this person killed his brother. Like
Yeah.
Because we also haven't talked about the fact that literally 2 years have passed.
It has been 2 years.
It's been 2 years since the end of chapter 4, because he spent like a year in a coma and then a year being gay with Henry. Yeah. So he's now like 2 years have passed and he's lived a whole life without even thinking of this monster.
Yes.
So for him to like bring this up, Elizabeth would be like, "What are you talking about?"
Exactly.
So yeah. So I completely agree, and then I also think there's another interesting thing there, which is this idea that like, you know who Alfred Hitchcock is?
I've heard of him, but I don't know.
Oh my god. Okay,
Educate me.
Yeah, he's a very famous like horror and suspense director, and he's quoted as saying, because he has these like crazy suspenseful movies, and he's quoted as saying that, you know, if there's characters sitting at a table, right, and a bomb goes off, you're like, whoa, like it's a big surprise and it's shocking, and that lasts for a couple seconds, and then you're done. The audience is, okay, what's next? Like, the bomb went off, we're past it, what's next? And suspense is showing the audience that there's a bomb under the table.
Right.
But the characters don't know that there is a bomb under the table. And so the characters are talking at this table, and there is a bomb that could go off. And as the audience, you're sitting there going, oh my god, when is the bomb going to go off? Are they going to realize there's a bomb? And if you can be in that state and draw that state out, you know, suddenly a couple seconds of a cool thing turns into a lengthy scene of this emotional attachment and this suspense and etc.
Sure. Yeah.
So this whole part of the book really got me thinking about that, because as we described, we as the audience through Victor know effectively that there is a bomb under the table.
Yeah.
And we've spent now 2 chapters, really the bulk of chapter 6, and all of chapter 7.
Yep.
With everybody in Victor's life going through the emotions, not knowing about this, and then to get to the end of this chapter, to have Elizabeth be like, okay, thank God, like it wasn't Justine. Oh, right. Like I found peace in my soul because it wasn't Justine. And meanwhile, there is still this bomb under the table that's gonna go of, oh, but the creature's out there.
Right.
Like, what is gonna come of that? What? And I thought that was a really good. I mean, at the, you know, everybody credits this with being a piece of sci-fi literature, which it is. It's also a horror, like it is a horror story.
Yeah.
In its nature as well. And I think that it's really interesting and cool that it has that little bit of suspense, and that we kind of end Act 1 with that, like, that suspense of when is this going to be found out? Like, what is, at what point does this now come to ruin in the way that Victor thinks? Right. Where he's like, uh-oh, like this, I think this might end up being something, and when is it going to become something?
Exactly,
So I think that's cool.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
So something else you pointed out in your analysis that I want to jump back on, and it dovetails quite nicely with what we just talked about in the previous chapter with like the feminist lens and what's Mary Shelley's worldview, what's she trying to say from like a feminist perspective. But I also find it fascinating, and the fact that it's still like relevant today is like really bad, but like that we get the absolute classic like woman pleading guilty because she was effectively abused by the people in charge and made to, even though she knew she wasn't guilty, that she was coerced by the powers that be into pleading guilty because it would just make things easier in the long run. Which is like a problem that, of course, somebody that had like a more to take a more feminist lens and worldview at the time, and reading this from a woman's like Mary Shelley is a woman author that wrote this. The fact that that's in there again, I think, has to be deliberate, because that is like at the time was such a experience, particularly for women. I mean, I understand that there was also in general just a lot of coercion in the government, but like particularly for women, and the fact that that has not changed. Like, I don't want to say not changed at all, but you know, like there was a TV show that came out a couple of years ago that addressed entirely that topic, and it was based on like the real life story of a I don't want to say the word because then we'll have to do like a trigger warning for the podcast and whatever. But an essay case.
Mm-hmm.
Figure out what essay means. And how a woman basically like pleaded guilty because she was coerced to plead guilty because she was made to feel crazy about this. And it's just like we're still there. Like it's just crazy that this book is written in 1818 and it's talking about that topic. And even in 1818, the perspective of Mary Shelley writing it was like, hey, this is dumb.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, why was she... And Victor and Elizabeth are like, oh, bro, like, it wasn't you? And she was like, no, I just had to plead guilty. And, like, yeah.
That is pretty crazy.
It is pretty crazy. And sad.
Very, very sad.
But, you know, I think it actually kind of answers I was saying, like, we don't necessarily know, like, how feminist Mary Shelley was. I mean, we can make assumptions. But I think the inclusion of that then really informs my thoughts on the previous chapter, which is, yeah, I think she's definitely, like, saying, hey, Alphonse is kind of a creep. And, like, it's wrong for him to view Caroline that way. So, yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Like,
additional thoughts?
Additional thoughts, not really. That was just, like, really insightful. I never thought about that connection. And especially how, like you said, how prevalent that kind of still is. And I found it also just striking in that case. I think they said Justine was, like, 15 at the time of her trial. And she was being prosecuted by, like, old men who were completely experienced and knew every way to manipulate.
Yeah,
so it's just, like, completely, like, not even... It wasn't even, like, there was even grounds and she lost. It was just, like, completely unfair and, like, disproportionate in, like, the opportunities she had to state her case. So.
Yeah, disproportionate is a good word. And then also I think that's funny because it ties into, like, we're talking so much about Alphonse, the father, right? And, like, he was an important law person. And, in fact, in the previous chapter, in chapter 6, his whole stance is, like, well, the justice system is great, and, like, it'll find her innocent or guilty, and that's what we should... Which I think then also ties into what we're trying to say about Alphonse and how he's just, like, a part of that, like, old man problem.
Yes, exactly.
I think these chapters in particular take a very, like, really... are more interesting when you read it from that lens.
Right, yeah.
Otherwise, it's pretty perfunctory. Like, it could be very perfunctory, like, these are the events that happened, but I think when you read it through that lens and you see what Mary Shelley's trying to talk about, I think it really increases, like, the weight of those chapters.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very eye-opening. When I first read it, for me, it was more just like, oh, court case, and then some cool thoughts at the end. But now it's like, I see it through a completely different lens.
Yeah,
it's awesome.
It's commenting.
The contents aren't awesome, but just, like, knowing that is awesome.
No, it's awesome, yeah. Coercion's great. Yeah, it's commenting about, like, the failure of the justice system, the failure, and why Victor maybe partially resents his father so much, and that worldview, which then also, I mean, if we're... I don't want to belabor the point, but if we are talking about it from, like, what it's supposed to represent and, like, the staunchiness of, like, old white men and their, you know, attempt to control things from a perspective they don't understand, then maybe Victor is gay. Maybe that all does line up, and the creation is, like, his attempt, you know.
Very true.
Maybe that all does line up. I don't know. Regardless, I think it's interesting to talk about.
100%.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of Volume 1,
which
also brings us the end to kind of the first act of the story. Before I talk about the 3-act structure a little bit, because that's more of a tangent, do you have any thoughts on, let's say, summarizing thoughts on these chapters, if there's anything we didn't get to, and then any summarizing thoughts on Volume 1 of the story?
In terms of the plot, we hit everything. For the previous chapters, I mean, I think this just... I feel like things are about to explode going into Volume 2.
Yeah.
Like, this is just the beginning. And I know you said chapters 1 to 4 was kind of just, like, set up, like, you know, and then getting into this, we're actually getting into more details now, and there's a lot of explaining to be done. So I'm excited to see what direction Mary Shelley's going to take with this, how things are going to be explained, and I'm just excited. I have no more questions. We cleared up the plot hole with Clerval, and we cleared up some other things, but let me know. Let me hear your thoughts on the 3-act structure.
Okay, let's do it. What do you know about the 3-act structure?
I mean, I know there's 3 acts, but I don't know much more.
That's good stuff. So a lot of what I know about the 3-act structure comes from writing, like, screenplays and learning about that, and because it's more strict in that format than it is in, like, a novel. But really, any narrative conforms to a 3-act structure, even if it's, like, a 5-act thing or a 1-act. Like, all narrative by definition is 3-act, There's a Plato.
Yeah, of course.
I think it was Plato, or was it Aristotle?
Well, tell me. I'll let you know. I'm in a philosophy class right now.
No, but you're not gonna know what I'm talking about.
Okay,
I think I have it on the shelf. I should go look. Anyway, there's a book. It's more of like an essay that he wrote. It's called The Poetics.
Okay.
And it's really just whichever one of them wrote it. I think it's Aristotle.
Okay.
I don't know. Talking about like the arts, like music and narrative and writing, and really like even as far back as that, he kind of lays out what a narrative is, and in laying out what it is, kind of explains the 3-act structure.
Okay, most likely Aristotle. Yeah.
Yeah, probably. And it's all about like, the setup, the drama, and then the fall, or success. And you can either like fail or succeed, and the conditions by which you can fail or succeed.
Yep.
Anyway, it's very short. I think like anybody that wanted to get into creative narrative, you should read it, because I think it explains like what a story is.
Right.
Like any story, if I sit here and I tell you a story and I say, so then this and that, this happened to me, whatever, and then I come to some conclusion, even if it's an anecdote about my life, like the way that we present story, if we do it well, sometimes somebody tells a story and you're like, oh my god, like what are you talking about? You know what I mean? But like people that present stories about their life well, even narratives about their life, tell it using the things that Aristotle and or Plato is talking about.
Yeah.
One sec. Okay, I just checked my bookshelf. It is Aristotle.
Okay.
So they tell it in the way that Aristotle is talking about.
Right.
But so in talking about the 3 acts a little bit more, I mean, to use language that I think will like make more sense to you, to a modern audience, I think one of my favorite writers who put me on, who referenced that like the Poetics by Aristotle is Aaron Sorkin. So anybody who doesn't know, I mean, if you listen to this podcast, you know that. But like, if you don't, Aaron Sorkin, right? A Few Good Men, The Social Network, Steve Jobs, Molly's Game, The Trial of the Chicago 7, so on and so forth. I mean, he's a very, very famous screenwriter. He's a playwright. He's won an Oscar. Also wrote The West Wing, The Newsroom, various TV shows. Anyway, he's my favorite. Like, actually, he's probably not anymore. But at the time, he's still great. But it's just I prefer someone else now. Amy Sherman Palladino. Anyway, we don't have to get into it. But like,
that's for another podcast.
It is. I mean, we've already done a podcast on Gilmore Girls, but we haven't done one on Maisel yet. Maybe maybe I can talk about her more on Maisel. But anyway, like his writing really spoke to me. Still does. Still, he's probably my second favorite. Right? He still speaks to me. And when I really deep dived on kind of his influences, one of the things that he was so adamant about was like there's so much junk like rules that aren't actually rules. Like you could buy a screenwriting book and say like on this page make sure you do this, and on that page, by this page in the story you should be doing that. And his whole thing was like, yeah, from like a format perspective I get it, but that's not like what a narrative is. Like what you should learn to do is write a narrative, and then once you know how to write a narrative, like don't worry about it, because then it could be a screenplay format or a stage play format or a book or a short story or whatever. But if you understand a narrative, you understand a narrative. And his whole recommendation was to read The Poetics by Aristotle. Anyway, this is a very long-winded explanation of trying to drive at what I'm driving at, which is that the original 1818 text of Frankenstein is written in 3 volumes, which I think, if I remember correctly, and getting to the end of volume 1 now, I think very much are in Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. So I wanted to talk a little bit about like what that actually is. And I think Sorkin explains the 3-act structure in a very simple way that I'm going to explain to you right now. Okay? So the 3-act structure for narrative is essentially that Act 1, you chase your protagonist up a tree.
Okay.
Act 2, you throw rocks at them while they're in the tree. And then in Act 3, the protagonist can either fall out of the tree and die, or they can use a rope to get back down out of the tree. But if they use a rope to get back down out of the tree, you have to have shown the audience in Act 1 or maybe the beginning of Act 2 that they have a rope with them.
Okay.
That is like the simplest possible explanation of the 3-act structure, okay? Which is you set up where you are, you make their life hell, and then they can either learn the lesson and succeed, or they cannot and they can fail. But one way or another, you have to kind of show the potential for that earlier in the story. You have to
Right.
call back to that and show either this person, because of these reasons that we set up, are going to be able to succeed, or this person is not going to be able to succeed. And it's fine. They can not succeed.
Yep.
Like, they can be punished. That's another idea from the Poetics, is the idea that, like, if you've broken sort of a fundamental rule, you should not be allowed to then get out of the tree at the end of the story.
Oh, okay.
You have to be punished for breaking that fundamental rule. So, like, the example Aristotle gives in the Poetics is murder. Like, if a character murders,
Right.
at the end of the narrative, they have to be punished. Like, it's not there is no retribution for that, which will really change the way you watch film and television, because learning about that, like, you see it all. I've started seeing it all the time, where it's like, if I'm watching something and a character has done a thing, and then the story attempts to tell a redemption arc, you can see where I'm like, oh, but they'll never be able to be truly redeemed in some way. They're always going to have to be punished in some way for that thing that they've done.
Yep.
It's just like a fundamental rule. And I think the absolute, like, I always go back to this example because I think it's such an easy one people understand, is when you're watching like a kid's show or a sitcom or whatever, and there's like a relationship and somebody lies, you know? It's like, that is always going to come to ruin.
Yes.
Like, the other person is always going to find out about the lie. There is always going to be a consequence to a lie. And that's a kid's thing that, like, even if you're not watching adult content yet, if you are a teenager and you're watching, you know, YA stuff, like young adult stuff, you're reading young adult books, right? Like, there's always going to be that thing of, like, you know, did you lie to your significant other? Did you do this bad thing? Did you do that bad thing? And there can be redemption and there can be, like, a coming to peace of it, but, like, narratively, in the overall narrative, that character has to be punished for the thing that they've done. So, yeah, that's kind of just like a general look at the 3-act structure. So far, I actually think that conforms to that pretty well. We set up who Victor is. So, what are the things that happen in Volume 1? We set up who Victor is.
Yep.
We go on this journey with him where he does the inciting incident for the story, which is create life. Now he's stuck in the tree. This creature is created. This creature is out there. And this creature may or may not be responsible for the death of his brother, but he can't tell anyone about it or do anything about it.
Yes.
And that's where we end Volume 1. So, effectively, Victor is now stuck in the tree. And Volume 2, you know, I haven't reread Volume 2 yet. I know you've got into it. But, again, if it were to follow the 3-act structure closely, Volume 2, if it was Act 2, would be predominantly about throwing rocks at Victor, who is stuck in the tree. Which just means making him deal with the consequences of his actions. What is the pain that Victor is going to go through for having created this monster? And what are the ramifications of it that he's going to have to deal with?
Right.
And then, you know, as we get into Volume 3 of the book, which I'm sure we'll call back to this and we'll talk about, it will be interesting to see, I know how it ends, it'll be interesting to see for you, you know, whether or not Victor is able to get out of the tree or not. And whether he was given the tools in Act 1 and learned the things in Act 1 to be able to do the things that he needs to do in Act 3 to get out of the tree.
Right.
Or whether he won't. Whether he'll fail. He'll fall out of the tree. So, yeah, that's... Any thoughts on the 3-act structure?
I mean, it's very interesting. Just based on what you said about, like, whether he's going to get out of the tree or not. I mean, he seems like he's at a pretty low point when he's telling Walton his story at the start.
Yeah.
So it's like... Yeah, I don't know.
Well,
like,
one interesting thing we have to think about... I mean, I know the answer to this, you know. But we also have to think about, like... So we started the story in media res, kind of. Because it picks up chronologically after... Well, definitely after Volume 1, now that we've read it. But we don't know... how do I say this? We don't know where in the story we're picking up from.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So you're thinking of it
I'm
as...
assuming it's after Victor tells his whole story.
You're thinking it's a framing device.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it's going to be beginning and ends.
Yeah.
Which I think is a reasonable assumption. It seems that way so far. But, yeah. I mean, I'm not going to spoil it one way or another for you.
Okay.
But we don't know... All I'll say is, in terms of this discussion, we don't know where that picks up. It could pick up in Volume 2, it could pick up at the start of Volume 3, or it could just be at the very end. I mean, we don't know. But regardless, one way or another, at some point we're going to pick up with it, and at
Yeah.
some point Victor is going to be in very bad shape.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
So
Interesting.
that's all we know.
Yeah.
But could that be him being in very bad shape at the end of Volume 2 after the stones have been thrown at him, the metaphorical stones, and now we have to deal with Act 3 of him being on this boat? I don't know.
Yeah. Because
I do know, actually, but
well, yeah,
you don't know,
I don't know.
so we'll see.
Yeah, I always just assumed this was like he was telling the story after the fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm excited now.
Yeah.
Gives me something to look forward to still.
You should be.
Of course.
There's a lot to look forward to.
Yeah.
Do you think... maybe one last question, one last prediction
Sure.
as we get to the end of this. Do you think that, based on everything I've talked about, based on having read Act 1 of this story, do you think there is a path for Victor to get out of the tree in Act 3? And and follow up. If you think there is, what do you think that path is? What do you think the lessons learned would need to be, the setup is, for Victor to be able to make it out of this story, I guess, okay, happy, moved on.
Right.
Everything's okay.
Right.
Big happy ending. Everybody rides off into the sunset,
Yeah.
getting what they want. How does Victor get to that point based on
Where we're at right now.
Act 1, if it's possible? Or do you think things have been put in place in Act 1 that, like we talked about, he just has to be punished for, and there is no version of him getting redemption or getting that ending? What do you think?
I do feel that there's this notion where he is going to be punished, but I don't feel like he has to be punished. I just feel like that is what is going to happen. I think he's going to suffer a lot because of what he's done.
Okay.
But I think that in terms of a way out of the tree, I think the first, if I could draw a little like picture right now, I think the first outline or the first point for that would have to be truth. I don't think his father would be receptive of the news that he's created this monster and given life to the inanimate.
Okay.
I think Elizabeth would be the only one to hear him out besides Clerval.
Okay.
Because obviously he's been knowing Victor's been up to stuff. Clerval and Elizabeth, I think, are going to be the two that if Victor can heal, they're going to help him with that emotionally. In terms of the actual situation, yeah, it's pretty messy. We don't know where the monster or the creature is. We've gotten like glimpses of him a little bit in the forest when he was on his way home from Ingolstadt. We don't know where he is. We don't know what the creature's motives are right now, or so it's really, I feel like we need to know more about the creature before I can like make a conclusion of, I think he's gonna get out of the tree. Yeah, I think a lot of it's up to the creature's motives.
Okay.
But I do think that emotionally there is some reconciliation that can be had. But in terms of actually him getting out of the tree with the monster and the actual situation he's in, I think that's kind of hard to tell right now.
Okay.
But yeah,
We'll see.
we're gonna have to wait and see.
Well, thanks for listening. We will be back with another episode. Now, I know we're not totally decided yet on how we're going to split it up, because we've been debating whether or not we want to do Volume 2 or Act 2 all as one episode.
Yes.
Maybe slightly longer, or if we want to do it in halves like we did with Chapter 1. It's tough because Volume 2, if I remember correctly, there is a large chunk, at least, of Volume 2 that is basically all connected.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like one sort of flowing narrative, whereas in this first volume, there's a lot of like jumping around and giving different context, whereas Volume 2 feels very contained. So even though it is like, how many chapters is it? 9?
9 yeah, Volume 2, yeah.
It's 9 chapters, but if those 9 chapters do flow in a way where it's like we have to talk about the thing as a whole, then maybe we'll be back with just a Volume 2 episode where we go through the entire second act. That's a little bit longer than what we've been doing. Or if we feel like there are some natural break points, maybe we'll split it up. So
Sure.
we don't know yet.
We'll play it by ear.
And listeners, you will find out next time we're back, which will be probably roughly in a week or so. Week and a half.
Yeah.
It depends on how much I can read, how busy work is. So
Yep.
we'll see.